Do you have an interest in the legacies that historical and not so historical figures leave behind? Are you curious about how to ensure family heirlooms and life lessons are passed on from generation to generation? Are you interested in developing your end-of-life plan to alleviate family discord and encourage generational wealth? Well, I invite you to listen to Heirloom and Legacy, a podcast that explores ancestry, heirlooms, legacy, mortality, and more. I am Angeline C. Fraser Giles, your host, and I look forward to sharing these discussions with you. I'm so pleased today to introduce Roberto Mighty, MFA. He is America's first artist in residence at a National Historic Landmark cemetery. He is an award-winning filmmaker, TV producer, multimedia artist, educator, and musician. His works include films, residencies, and exhibitions at Harvard University, the National Science Foundation, the Library of Congress, and film festivals. Roberto is founder and principal of Celestial Media, LLC, a new film, TV, multimedia studio specializing in creative, inclusive content for today's audiences. Roberto is a host producer of Getting Older, the new half-hour public television series about aging across America that's due to premiere nationwide in January 2022. He is the host and producer of World's Greatest Cemeteries, the new half-hour public television series about international burial grounds and inclusive history, which premiered in October 2021. He is now filming season 2. That's how popular it was. Roberto's historical documentary about Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King, Legacy of Love, hosted by Emmy Award-winning newscaster Reverend Liz Walker, is newly available to public TV stations as of January 2022. Mr. Mighty taught cinematography, editing, and production for 12 years at Boston University and Emerson College. He is a proud dad, holds a black belt in Taekwondo, plays guitar in a jazz duo with his sweetheart and musical partner, Catherine Howell. And he professes that he needs to get more exercise. I think we all could profess to that. So with that, I welcome Mr. Roberto Mighty. Hello.
Hello there. Hello. I love how you pronounce my name, like, wow, like from the old country. That's perfect. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I can trill my R's. I speak a little Spanish, as I know you speak Spanish, and I can trill the R's. I learned that. I learned that much.
Excellent.
So again, thank you for being with us today. And what I want to talk to you a little bit about is just your trajectory. I just think it's so interesting to have someone that could really talk about going to historical cemeteries, because I find cemeteries, some of them to be very, very beautiful. They're very somber places in, the United States and around the world. They could have the potential to be really somber places and really sad. But in actuality, a lot of cemeteries around the world are quite beautiful.
Yes.
So I'm just curious for you to talk a little bit about how you came to want to do a series where you were going to cemeteries around the world.
Well, thank you so much. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Well, it goes back to when I was a kid, and my parents met when they were students at Wilberforce University in Ohio. And they would always tell us kids, they would sort of remark that they used to go to this cemetery that was near the campus, and they would recite poetry to each other. And then they would start reciting the same poems, And so when I was a kid, I actually thought that the word cemetery meant place to recite poetry.
That is pretty funny. And how romantic.
Yes, very romantic indeed. So of course, when I was a little boy, I knew nothing about that sort of thing. I just thought, okay, whatever, when's dinner ready? When's dinner going to be ready?
Get back from the cemetery and make dinner.
Exactly, that's right. So late in my career, to make a really long story short, I knew an artist who was doing a performance at a historic cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that the people who ran the cemetery, they said that they needed a videographer to come and film this performance. And so my acquaintance really said, "Oh, I know this guy Roberto Mighty, and he's just your man, So they hired me to come in and videotape actually a dance performance at the cemetery. And I must say, now that was 2012. And that was, I guess, 11 years ago. And I got to say that this cemetery was so beautiful. As it turns out, this was the world famous Mount Auburn Cemetery as I said, in the USA, in Cambridge, which is the very first cemetery of its type in the United States. There's this word that cemetery people use called consecrated, which means dedicated, right? In 1831. And it is a botanical masterpiece and an arboretum with many, many incredible trees from all over the world, and sculptures and beautiful mausoleums. A mausoleum is the little tomb. It looks like a little house, where some people bury their parents, their entire families. And the mausoleums at this cemetery many of them are quite ornate. And I was like, this place is gorgeous, And so a couple of years later, as one of the great historic cemeteries in the United States, they had decided to start a program where they were going to put in or create a position for an artist in residence, sort of a temporary position. And they asked me to be their first artist in residence in this program. And I was like, sure.
And at the time, did you know what you have a master's in fine arts, so you knew what an artist in residence was,
right.
But this coming from someone who's running a cemetery,
right?
Could you have imagined when you were getting that MFA that this is where you would find yourself?
No. And what's so funny is that you're right. I knew what an artist residency was all about. I also knew that technically in a real artist residency, the people who are commissioning you aren't supposed to tell you what to do, right? So this is very important because I had some ideas about what I'd like to do. And I remember saying, well, I'll do it on the grounds that I get to do exactly what I want. And I'm going to take as long as I want to do it.
That's a nice contract.
Yeah, it's a great contract. But I have to say, after that first initial bit of videography, I then did some other projects for them. And, we knew each other by then. And, they sort of laughed, said, yeah, sure. And, but what I wanted to do was, this cemetery has some well-known people in it, like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, or a Romantic era poet, and Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the Christian Science Church, and some other people, Harriet Jacobs, who was an African-American author of a book called Diary of a Slave Girl.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, plus, many other, like 90,000 other people,
Mm-hmm.
And what I wanted to do a series of films that would focus on the lives of not so famous people. And I specifically wanted to zero in on outsiders, people who were marginalized in their day. So to me, that meant women in general. That meant people who were African-American, immigrants to this country, Hispanic, Native American, LGBTQ. So again, outsiders. And I tried to pick people who had interesting life stories. And so I like to do three things. I like to read a lot, like a lot. And I like to play music, and I like to do research. So it was a lot of fun for me to sort of do online research, and then also go to archives and do archival research about dead people who had died a long time ago, who had interesting lives. So anyway, I wound up over the course of 2 years making 29 short films about interesting dead people at this National Historic Landmark Cemetery. And while I was there, I also, some of the films were not about people, they were simply about the landscape itself, which is beautiful. And I wanted to film that landscape at all 4 seasons of the year. And I have to tell you, to share with the audience and you that I say the best time to go to a cemetery is in a blizzard. And the reason is because there's nobody else there.
Nobody else is there. That is for
Nobody
sure.
else. Honestly, there's no one else there. And you can just, I don't know, I can relax when there's no one else around, no one else living anyway.
Well,
right?
exactly. Let's be clear. There are people there.
That's right.
There are spirits there.
That's right. Well,
just no one walking around.
There's no one walking around. Exactly right. I have to say, the other thing is the wildlife is out. So when there are fewer people around, you see the wild animals. And many of the great cemeteries around the world, including this one, and I could challenge your listeners, I'd say that almost without fail, there's a great cemetery within like 100 miles of their house, wherever they live, right? And many of the great cemeteries are de facto wildlife preserves. And the reason is because they've got all this green space. They have a lot of trees, they have a lot of plants and vegetation. And so the animals like to hang around in those cemeteries, but generally you don't see them when there's, a lot of people around, like during normal opening hours.
Right, right.
So
well, that's pretty fascinating. And I'm curious, when you were doing the films, did you talk to, since I wasn't able to see any of them, did you speak to people who were visiting the cemetery? Are they included in the process of the films, or it was just from a historical perspective as who was buried there? Did you take it from just that perspective?
That's a great question. And yeah, you are so perceptive. I not only did I choose people who had perished in the 19th century, or I also picked people who had died very recently. So I got a chance to interview their loved ones in some cases. So there was one young woman whose mother had died, and this young woman was in law school, so she was, I guess, in her early 20s, and her mother had died when she was even younger than that. And I interviewed a woman whose wife had died. In fact, they were one of the first legally married lesbian couples in the United States, and I interviewed her. By the way, when I would see these people at their home, and I would ask them to show me any heirlooms or things that their loved one had handled. Do you know what I mean? Like a favorite, jewelry or dishes or whatever it was. And then also I would interview them graveside at the grave of their loved one. And so, so I did find some people like that who were more recent. I also did talk with some people who just visit the cemeteries, but they didn't make it into that project. So that project was done like in 2017. And then around 2018, I began, it was really well received, by the way. People really loved it. I had some screenings and some performances like with interactive multimedia that I created using multiple computers and stuff. And I thought it would kind of be cool to make a TV series out of this. You make it something ongoing. And that's why I got that idea about 2018. And to anyone who's interested in getting into this field, let me tell you, you have to have a lot of patience because I worked on developing that project for 2 years until about.
I would imagine that it takes the getting permissions from the various cemeteries, and if they have board of directors and
yes,
and all of that you have to go through, and they want to make sure that it is preserved as a sacred space and not, I guess, sensationalized in a way.
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
So
no, that's brilliant. In fact, one particular cemetery in London, they had gone through a period in the 1990s when people did all sorts of things related to like Halloween type stuff, and Halloween, I think, is a cute holiday for kids, but when it's grown people doing really strange and unsettling things after
Yes.
dark, it's not cool, So
Right.
they were very concerned, like, who is this Roberto Mighty guy from America? What do you intend to do in the cemetery? And why should we let you in? So yes, there are all those permissions you have to get. But also, what takes a long time is deciding what the tone of the program is going to be, like,
Mhm.
and who is going to host it. And at first I was thinking, well, Morgan Freeman, I don't know. And then you find out how much those celebrities cost. You're like, okay,
Exactly.
I'll do it.
Let me just do this myself.
Let me just do it. Honestly, that was the trajectory, to use your word. I was like,
Yeah.
oh man, that's, the project will never get off the ground.
Right. They come at a
So,
premium price.
yes. And I work cheap, as a host.
Right. So the episode that I saw in the World's Greatest Cemeteries that you did is the one where you go to France. First of all, traveling to France, I think, would be pretty exciting, pretty fun. I've never been to France.
Uh-huh.
And visiting the cemetery where Alexandre Dumas is buried,
Yes.
and learning about that history. So could you talk a little bit about going to that particular cemetery, but also the history of Alexandre Dumas? And for those who may not know, just give them a little background of who he is,
Right.
or who he
Thank
was.
you. So thank you. So I have to say, as a kid, I admired the Three Musketeers, because anything, like any movie where there is a guy with a sword, I was like, yes, I'm there.
Yeah.
Plus riding horses and having girlfriends, I was like, yes, this is my future I see for myself.
Right.
And so I'd always admired, again, the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo and all that. And I remember I even read the books, right? And it's funny because I must have been older when I read those books, because they're not children's books, and they're long, they're very long. But I did read those books at some point along the way. And then I saw every movie and TV version of those films. And somehow I never knew that Alexandre Dumas was a person whose grandmother was an enslaved woman in Haiti, right, in Haiti, that his grandfather was a well-to-do French aristocratic, gentleman, and that this man took Alexandre Dumas' father to France, right? So he's a mixed race child, back to France, and put him like in the best schools. I was thinking, what?
Yeah.
And then Alexandre Dumas' father joined the army. He became a general, and he became a general in Napoleon's army. Now, come on, really? And
Incredible story.
And totally true. Like, everything I said is 100% true. There are paintings of him. And by the way, he was a real gentleman as well. So anyway, that's a whole long story, right? And which I never knew. And by the way, I have a degree in history. Somehow this fact, had escaped me. So Alexandre Dumas then was a mixed race person, which that's what he was, thought of as. And I finally saw photographs of him, and I just want the listeners to just go ahead, just look him up, just look up Alexandre Dumas and check out the photos. You're like, what? So he was one of France's most famous and most prolific authors. He made and lost fortunes, more than once. He was very well known. He was a famous ladies' man, if you will.
Oh, see, I didn't know that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he was.
But the picture that I've seen, he's very handsome. So
see, there you go. And apparently he had a lot of confidence. He was legendary for having a whole lot of girlfriends. I guess they would call them mistresses. And he also built a beautiful home on the banks of the river Seine in France, outside of Paris. And that is where that house that he built in 1840 something is now a house museum. And so that's where I went, because his body is actually in a very famous mausoleum called the Pantheon in the center of Paris. But because of COVID, I wasn't able to go into that building. And by the way, in the Pantheon is where they have some of France's greatest heroes and heroines are interred. They're not really buried, like it's a whole building. It's a beautiful building. And in that building, they have tombs. And so they have like Victor Hugo, of course, he wrote Les Miserables, right? Which a lot of people would know from the Broadway shows. And they have various other famous French people. And anyway, Alexandre Dumas is there. But I was able to go to his fabulous chateau and interview the curator of that house museum. And she is an expert about him, of course. And I spent an afternoon there. And you'll see that you saw that in that episode.
Yes.
And she was very, knowledgeable and patient. And she gave me a tour of the house and the grounds, and the gardens are incredible, right? And so, anyway, so that was that in that episode. Let me just say that one thing I'm trying to do with that series, World's Greatest Cemeteries, is show people how inclusive world history is, right? So the series, if it weren't for COVID, we would have gone even more places, right? But in the course of the first season, we went to London, Paris, Hollywood, Brooklyn, Cincinnati, several other places. And everywhere I took the show, I would find some people who were famous, but then also I'd look for those people who were, again, marginalized in their day. And in many cases, those people are people of color, of course. They are people who, perhaps, they're immigrants, and again, I'm specifically also always looking for LGBTQ people and all that. But they were marginalized in their day, but they made some incredible contribution. So in the case of Alexandre Dumas, his contribution was the Three Musketeers and the Count of Monte Cristo, and by the way, a whole lot of other stuff.
Right. Well, I just found it fascinating when I did learn about the history of Alexandre Dumas a couple of years ago. I said, wow, because I think also like you, I've read the stories later in life. It definitely wasn't assigned in school. And all of the movies that you see of the Three Musketeers, no one looks like Alexandre Dumas.
Exactly. It's deep.
No one. And so to learn that history, that it's almost, maybe it's not an intentional suppression of the history, but it was definitely not something that was widely broadcast, that this was a man of color, writing these amazing stories, this prolific writer who has a chateau in France.
Yes.
And was a ladies' man, and all of the things that went on, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of that, all his great writing, his writing skills, and all of that. So it's really amazing that you interweave the stories of the people, the history of the cemetery, the architecture, the landscape. All of that is interwoven in the series, and you go from one cemetery to the next, and really, like, the flow of it is just absolutely beautiful. The way you weave together all of the imaginations of what these people were like, the ornateness of the cemeteries. And that was one of the scenes in that particular episode, where you had the curator that was showing you the different iconography on the actual headstone.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for bringing that up, because it's one of those things that I don't think most of us think about. I certainly hadn't thought about. Like, when you go to any cemetery and you look on the headstones, there's all kinds of little figures, right? There's all sorts of, sometimes they're flowers, sometimes they're trees, sometimes they are people, and these are all sculpted, bang, bang, chisel, chisel.
Right.
That takes a lot of time and expertise, and let's face it, a lot of money to hire someone to do that. And why is that done? So I began to notice, as I traveled, around the country and overseas, that I would see certain kinds of figures again and again. Like, for instance, you would see like the Christian cross. Well, that's an easy one. and everyone knows what that means, right?
Mhm.
And then you might see the Star of David. Well, that's another one you can imagine. Okay, the person who is buried there was Jewish. Okay, get that. But then what about the flowers and the leaves and the twigs and the hourglasses and the death's heads and the skeletons? Like, what does all that mean? So you're describing in episode number 5, I got this wonderful expert, Meg Winslow from Mount Auburn Cemetery. And I asked her to just take me through, some, while I was filming away, take me through some of these symbols and let's find out what they mean. And she was great. She said, okay, the oak leaves mean this, the ivy leaves mean that. And the people at that time, they knew those things. Like, it's almost like if you were to walk down the street and say to people, okay, who's Stevie Wonder? Well, everyone would know who Stevie Wonder is, right?
Right. Or at least we hope so.
They
better know who Stevie Wonder is.
That's right. That's a good point. That's an excellent point. But back in those days, everyone, people understood, okay, that's an oak leaf. I dare say a lot of people today wouldn't know one leaf from another, right?
Right.
But people, they were closer to the land. A lot more people were farmers. So they got it. Okay, those are pine needles, those are walnuts, those are acorns. And all these things had meaning to those. They understood the symbolism behind all those natural symbols. So that I just want to say this, that what was really cool was to go to a cemetery in Cincinnati, Ohio, and see some symbols on the grave of a German family that had, let's say, a person that died in 1862, and then go to a cemetery in London and see that same symbol. It's like, get out of town, right? That was so cool to understand. Oh, now I understand what
that cross-cultural
means.
connection and people understanding, regardless of where they are, they understood the symbolicism.
Yes,
exactly. Of what those things meant. Because I would never walk into a cemetery necessarily and look at leaves that may have been, you just think, oh, they just wanted to make something decorative, but the leaves actually have a meaning. I remember when my grandmother, grandfather were from Honduras, and my mother, when my grandmother is and my grandfather buried in Honduras, and my mother had bought these 2 angels for the crypt. And when my mother died, she died in Honduras, and we ended up taking the 2 angels off and then replacing them. And then one year we went back and one of the angels was missing, and someone took the angel, and it's like a big stone thing that's cemented onto the top of the grave. It's just like, who does that?
That's so low.
That is just who desecrates a grave like that?
Exactly. Yeah, that is
but
low.
Whatever symbol my mom had for these angels, she must have thought that her mom was an angel. And so now you go into cemeteries, and after looking at this series, you could have a different appreciation for going into a cemetery and seeing all of the ornate, elements on a particular tombstone, or if there wasn't anything innate, right? Exactly. Ornate, because that could also signify that this person either was buried, they didn't have a family, or they didn't have the money in which to put a headstone that is so ornate.
That's right, exactly. And sometimes, it was explained to me, I went to an historic cemetery in Concord, Massachusetts, right? And people might think, okay, Concord and Lexington, and they think of those early Revolutionary War battles, fought in New England. And it was explained to me that the Puritans, the Puritans were religious separatist sect that came out of England in the 17th century, and came to America after being thrown out of England and thrown out of Germany and thrown out of Holland. And these are the people that we call the Pilgrims, right? But anyway, many of the Pilgrims were members of this religious sect, the Puritans. And we think of the Puritans, as the people who would burn women at the stake in Salem, as so you begin to think about this and to put all these things together. And by the way, it's not like I'm a genius. I've just been studying this now for a while, you know,
Right, right.
and I talk to people, and I like to
Well,
read a
you
lot.
are a genius too, but
No,
yeah.
no, no,
Okay.
no, no. You know, you you see, it was explained to me that the Puritans did not believe in ornamentation. You know, they didn't believe. They thought that, for instance, the you mentioned Catholicism earlier, and they thought that the stained glass windows and the high, beautiful buildings with all the ornate carvings were really sinful and, really in poor taste, to say the least, And so on their graves, you didn't have, they didn't put crosses on their graves, right? They were Christians. They didn't put, so it's just, so their graves would look very bare and lacking ornamentation to us, but that's not because they didn't have money. It was more like because they thought that that sort of ornamentation was blasphemous. It was a sin against God. So anyway, it's just, it's great to pick up these things and I love talking with the experts. One of the things I love to do on the show is find people who are in fact experts, on these things, usually people who have written books about these topics or are university professors. They've studied this thing all of their lives. And it's a lot of fun to bring them to the cemetery and say, okay, let's look at this grave. What can you tell us about the shape of the stone, what the stone's made of, the position of the stone, which way the stone is facing, east, west, north, south? Is it at the foot of the grave, or is that the headstone or a footstone? All these things, they all have meaning and they can all be interpreted. And I like to think, in fact, one of my viewers wrote in that going to a cemetery is like a walking history lesson.
Yes.
That was so cool.
That is very interesting. It is. It is. If you read the headstones and just look at all of the, the difference between a mausoleum and, maybe an area where they might have cremated remains, or,
yes,
the headstones, and a smaller headstone as opposed to a huge crypt.
right.
Yeah. Definitely tell the story. So I want to go back and then come forward again, but I want to go back because you mentioned I believe it was the Mount Auburn Cemetery where Harriet Jacobs is buried. Yes, and right. The extent to which people knew or know of her burial site, and if they're visitors to any of the famous people visit, like people, that as you talk about, that you want to also get the stories of just the average person, the immigrant, the people who are, discriminated against, disenfranchised, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, group. Right. Harriet Jacobs being a Black woman writer, just in her day, were there people that knew that is where she is buried, or know that that's where she buried, and actually go to these sites? Like, do you find that as you go through these various cemeteries that people come to visit those particular sites? And is there any other particular, security in respect to that?
That's another great question. Wow. I love the questions you're asking and your engagement here. So, yeah, I have found that Harriet Jacobs, Jean-Michel Basquiat, the great modern artist who is buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, George Eliot, the great novelist. Who is buried, that's right, Silas Marner, right, in Highgate Cemetery in London. When you go to these people's graves, you can see little things that were left. I was just visiting. We were just filming at the grave of Henry David Thoreau, the famous New England philosopher, and people leave different kinds of things. So, for instance, at Thoreau's grave, people leave pencils. I thought, well, that's because he's a writer, but I didn't know until, again, I had an expert with me, and she said, "Oh, Henry Thoreau's family had a pencil factory." I'm like, "What?"
History.
Isn't that great?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I would have thought because he's a writer. And when you said his whole name, it wasn't until you said Thoreau that I knew who you were referring to, because right. when you hear the name, you hear Thoreau.
Exactly.
And then you don't hear the whole name. So thank you for that.
Well, again, I just want to be really clear with everyone. It's not like I know all this stuff going in. Like, I love learning about it. I love sharing
Yes.
that learning process with the audience. And so, yes, if you go to Harriet Jacobs' grave at Mount Auburn Cemetery, you'll see people leaving. Very often they leave stone. Have you ever noticed people leaving small stones on top of?
Yes.
Right. There was the dog in The Wizard of Oz whose name is Toto. Right. And Toto, there's a monument to Toto at a cemetery called Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
And
I kind of vaguely remember someone mentioning that.
Yeah.
Or that Toto has a cemetery.
He has a beautiful statue that looks just like him.
Okay.
And anyway, so on Toto's statue, people leave like little dolls of dogs and, or maybe some object that's related to the Wizard of Oz. But I saw these things with my own eyes. I was like, oh, wow, check that out. So yeah, there's a lot of people who know about these things. And by the way, in many cases, people come from around the world to these graves, like people in Asia, South America, Africa, the Caribbean, Europe. They know about people like Harriet Jacobs and Jean-Michel Basquiat and George Eliot and Richard Wright, who's buried, the famous African-American author Richard Wright, buried in a cemetery in France, in Paris, and they will come and they will leave their little mementos or little tributes. So there is the idea of this worldwide community, of people who love history or who just maybe they like that person, right? They feel some connection to that person. Mm-hmm. And they will go there and do a little I shouldn't say little, they'll do a pilgrimage to the grave. For instance, there's a cemetery in London, also it's Highgate Cemetery, where Karl Marx is, supposedly the father of communism, is buried.
Yes.
And they told me they get busloads of people coming.
I can imagine.
Busloads, that's right, and leaving tributes on his grave. Someone like Harriet Jacobs, in my opinion, is not as famous as like Harriet Tubman, but still, no, I definitely see little tributes there. Mm-hmm. You asked about security. The famous landmark cemeteries do have security. And it's not like it's guys walking around with firearms, they just have the security. They're more like, they direct traffic and so forth. But yeah, some cemeteries do have problems with knuckleheads going in and stealing things, like they stole the angel off your loved one's grave. That's really disgusting, I think. But yeah, there are people out there. The other thing is that in some of these mausoleums, I hate to say this in public, but some of them have, let's put it this way, they were built by very, very wealthy people. Mm-hmm. So there's some people who like to go in and rob the mausoleums. Now, by the way, what's the most famous mausoleum in the world? Well, the Great Pyramid at Giza, right?
Okay.
I know, right? And that's deep, isn't it? That's right. Yeah. That is the mausoleum.
It is. It's you wouldn't think. I mean, you don't think about it that
exactly.
way.
You don't think
right?
about it. That's King Tut's tomb. And the only reason why King Tut's tomb was undisturbed was that people couldn't figure out how to get into it. But the minute they did get into it,
yes,
they took a lot of stuff out of there, including King Tut, who's now in a museum, right? And somehow, this is controversial, but somehow when a museum does it, it's like, oh, well, that's a cultural thing. But not everyone agrees with that.
Right,
and
right.
In many cases, these museums now are being asked to, or they're being prevailed upon to return those precious heirlooms to the country where they were looted from, before. Mm-hmm. And now sometimes a deal is made so that the famous museum can keep the looted objects, and some sort of deal is made with that country. But I just want to say that grave robbers are grave robbers, period. But the truth is that I love going to a museum and seeing those things.
Yeah.
And of course, and I've seen mummies in museums like, wow, this is great. I don't have to go to Egypt to see a mummy. I can go to my local museum.
Mhm.
But at least I'm aware of the contradictions, so someone
No, it's
took,
a very interesting way to look at it, because yeah, you don't consider them grave robbers if it's a museum, but in actuality, that's what it is, because they have disturbed the sacred burial ground of this person, whether they're famous or not. They have disturbed it. I was telling you that my husband and I had gone to visit the African burial site that they believe is an African burial site, based on various documentations of John Dickinson's plantation.
Mhm.
And it's here in Delaware and not too far from here. And there are no headstones, and it has been, mowed over. It was planted, and they've been able to determine that they believe this is where they don't even know how many Africans were buried there, enslaved, indentured people that were buried in this cemetery, that's adjacent to the major highway getting you from point A to point B in Delaware, it's north and south. And it's just absolutely devastating to think that there may or may not have been headstones there, but the land is just, it's sacred space. And they are trying to determine, whether or not to even dig up the graves to find the remains, because they want to make sure that they do it in a very respectful way. And here, and I don't know, this may be in other areas where you cannot just dig up a body without permissions from a descendant. Can't just do it.
Right. And
So, and maybe a lot of laws have changed over the years so that it does protect, sacred ground, and you can't just, whoever you are, whether you're a museum or educational institution or just the average person, you can't just go and dig up a grave and desecrate,
right.
someone's final resting place.
Well, with that said, fact is that it does happen all the time, though. And, because in fact, major European cities were burying people for years in churchyards, right?
Right.
And those churchyards became, for instance, in Victorian England, those churchyards by the 18th century, by the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, some of those churchyards, there were so many bodies and they were stacked, like stacked under each other. There are so many bodies that, like, this is kind of gross, but when it rained, sometimes, the layer of topsoil would go, would flow away. And then there were bones and other remains sticking up into the air.
Mm-hmm.
So this became, in many cities, not just London, in America, even in many cities, this became a problem. People were accustomed to burying people in that place over there, and then what happens when that place over there gets filled up?
Right.
Now, what do you do? And then, of course, as cities grew, very often these churchyards and were built. They were not in the village. The church was like a little bit outside the village or to the left of the village or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as the village grew, it kind of grew around the church, and then after a while, that land became valuable,
right,
and more valuable. So, pretty much, I'm almost going to say in every major city, buildings are built over what were formerly graveyards.
mm-hmm.
And I think what's happening now is that some people are beginning to think, well, I guess we're going to have to, people want to build a highway that, over there, because that's the shortest distance between this place and that place. But maybe we can dig up, the interred, remains and have some sort of ceremony and move those bodies. And so that is, in fact, another thing that goes on, where sometimes they take the bodies and they move them to another place. Now, of course, that's expensive, isn't it? Right?
Yes.
It's a lot cheaper to just put a bunch of more dirt over it.
Right.
And
I think that's what happened. That's what happened in Delaware here, on
right.
John Dickinson's plantation, that it was just someone knew that there were bodies there, right? That it was
Right.
a cemetery, but it didn't matter. And now the state has control of the property. And so they are really not going to do anything. There's farmland around it, but they're just waiting it out to make sure that nothing happens to it. So we will see.
Yeah, we'll
We
see.
shall
Yeah.
see. We shall see. You know how
Yes,
much more
that's right.
valuable it becomes as the area grows.
Exactly. So I do think, though, that I honestly don't know what the answer is to all this, because cities do grow, and that whatever that land is becomes more valuable. I'm not saying cemeteries should be built over. All I'm saying is that it does happen, right? They are built over. And I think the question becomes, what do we as the current custodians of that land, as the citizens of that city or that village or whatever it is, do we have any responsibility to acknowledge those interments, those burials? Do we have any responsibility for some kind of ceremony, before they build a skyscraper on it, or do we insist that the skyscraper not be built, or the apartment house or whatever it is, or do we insist that they move the bodies? And these are ongoing issues, but I want to pick up on something else that you've used the word spirits many times. And, it's an interesting thing. Now, there are some people who believe in spirits, some people don't. But I would say that what fascinates me is what people believe about the dead, right? And different cultures have different beliefs. I'm really looking forward to going to Muslim cemeteries and Chinese cemeteries and Japanese cemeteries, and Jewish cemeteries. And Catholic cemeteries. These are places that we didn't have the chance to go to a lot of places because of COVID, right? In the first season. But I'm really looking forward to comparing and contrasting how people think about the dead, how people think about the ancestors, how people think about whether or not there are spirits there, and if so, do they have some sort of responsibility? It's utterly fascinating, and I think to a great degree it makes us human, to think about the dead and to think about our ancestors.
Yeah. Well, I always feel like there's my mom surrounding me, protecting me. That she died when I was young, so I think of it that way. And just because of the fact, I guess, that I am not fearful so much of the death, and it's taken me a little while to get there, which is why I really want to ensure that my work is engaging people and encouraging people to talk about the end of life, that it is something that is going to happen. It's not a maybe, it is a definite. And the more that we are prepared for what that is for ourselves and our loved ones, I think the better off that we will be. And with that, I want to move into you talking a little bit about your other series that you are involved with, that you are getting ready to go into the second season, which is Getting Older, and talking about what that means, and the various people that you spoke to about getting older and what it means to them as they go into this, being 55 and older, and how they think about aging.
Thank you. Yeah, this is it's a fascinating topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
And, I started this show concept when I myself noticed. I was 50 years old when I noticed a change in my body. And before people start trying to imagine something, I'll tell you what it was. So I was sitting in a room in my house reading, and I happened to look up at the ceiling. And like a lot of houses, the ceiling was, painted white. And I just looked up from my book for a split second. I noticed what seemed to be bugs on the ceiling. And I was like, like all these bugs crawling on the ceiling. ceiling above my head. I was like, that is disgusting. And, I like to keep the house clean. So I was, horrified in general. And then I sort of looked down again at the book, and I saw that there were bugs on the pages of my book. I'm like, bugs. And I thought it was a weird sudden infestation of insects in just in that one room, and and it took me maybe a minute to understand that these objects were in my eyes.
Oh my gosh.
Right, that they were actually swimming around. I said,
oh,
parasites.
The bugs are swimming in his eye.
I thought it's like a horror movie, like a horrible sci-fi movie. I was like, no, I'm dying. So I called the nurse with my health plan, and I described my symptoms, and I could hear her trying not to laugh. But she said, sir, you're not going blind, and there are no bugs in your eyes. But I will make an appointment for you to see your doctor right away. I said, thank you. So I was like, I can't go blind. I'm a filmmaker.
Panic stricken.
Panic. So some people listening will immediately understand what this was. But at that moment, I had no idea. So make a long story short, I went to see the doctor. And she listened to me, and she looked, and that thing, they look in your eyes. She said, yes. Well, the good news is that you're not going blind. And she also was trying not to laugh. And she said, these are called floaters, the little particles of tissue that break off, and they sort of float around in there. Then they usually kind of go away. The reason why you saw them when you looked at a white ceiling is because, like they were suddenly backlit, by them, and it's no big deal. And she said, don't worry, you're just getting older. And I was like, no. That's for other people. There must be some mistake.
Right.
Not me. Nope.
There's a scene that I always talk about. It makes me laugh. The scene in When Harry Met Sally, and Meg Ryan is sitting on the bed, and she's talking to Billy Crystal, and she's crying because this guy she was dating, he's about to get married, and she's just crying, and she's like, I'm gonna be 40. And he says, when? And she says, someday. Not like tomorrow, next week. Someday. He's gonna be 40. And so, as someone who turned 40 myself, I turned 40, and I was in that panic stricken, like, oh my gosh, I left the 30s and now I'm 40. And so when I became 50, it just was like a nothing. It's just like, okay, I'm 50. And now at 55, I'm just like, okay, so what's next after this? So tell us a little bit about some of your, the folks that you interviewed for this series.
Okay, thank you for asking. I love that story. And by the way, you're one of those people who, I'm only seeing you on Zoom, but I want to tell your listeners that this lady, with all due respect, she's a married lady. This is all very proper.
It's very proper.
Very proper. Please don't. I don't want your husband coming after you with a stick. But but you have beautiful skin, and there's not a line in your face, right? So you've got good genes. You got those good genes.
Good genes and a whole lot of moisturizer that comes every week.
There you go. So for the series, I wanted to find out what people felt about aging, because at that moment I realized that I had only negative associations about it. There's nothing positive in my mind about it. And I thought, no, first it's floaters. What's next? And then I had all these horrible, I'm not going to bore people with what my fantasies were, but they were all negative, like all the things that were going to go wrong or stop working or, or whatever. So what I decided to do is I decided to start interviewing other people who were 50 and over and just ask them, what does getting older mean to you? I came up with 7 questions, and that was one of them. And then another one was, is this, what do you want to do before you die? Because to me, I was like 50, I'm going to die any minute. you know,
It's about to happen.
it's about to happen. And so forth. So I started into this 2014, I started interviewing, friends. And I quickly found out that it was interesting. I was surprised at how interesting it was, because people had different ideas about it. Now my cohort was about 50 years old, right? My pals. So I realized that I was going to have to get people at different ages. So I began to spread the word, for people 50 plus. And I said, I'm looking for people 50 to 100, and then I also wanted it to be diverse, because this is a sort of a running theme in my work. As you and I have discussed, your parents are from Honduras, and my father's from Panama. My mother is from Cincinnati. So I always had that feeling of being kind of an outsider, like
Yes.
not totally fitting in, and so I wanted to get people who were, of various, ethnic heritages, different religions, different cultural backgrounds, in different parts of the country. And so that was 2014 when I started. So fast forward to 2020, by then I had gone from my original 7 questions to 27 questions. That's because every time I'd ask someone, let's say I asked someone, what's your greatest regret? That is one of the questions. And then they'd answer that question. Then they say, well, you haven't asked me what was the greatest love of my life. I said, oh, okay. What was the greatest love of your life?
Oh my gosh.
So
they were giving you questions.
Yes,
they were helping you with your research.
They were helping me with my research. You said it. That's, once again, very perceptive. Yeah, they were totally helping me, inadvertently with my research. And so I came up with 27 questions that I feel I could ask anyone, male, female, transgender, wherever they're from. I could ask these same 27 questions of anyone. And it was important to me that I asked everyone the same questions in the same order, because it starts out with, what does getting older mean to me? And it ends with, where do I want my remains buried? So it gets progressively more serious. So it starts out being kind of fun. And by the end, it's like, wow.
I have to think about that.
Exactly.
Yes, I know.
And so it's utterly fascinating. And so at this point, for season 1 of that series, there'll be 13 half-hour episodes. People will see a pair of Native Alaskan people who, in the old days, we might have called them the word that begins with E, but I've been told that word is actually a pejorative. It's a very negative word that people don't like to use anymore. So, but
I didn't know that either. So
yeah, I didn't know that at the time. So I have people from Native Americans from Alaska to people. I've got a wonderful singer from Puerto Rico, and I've got people who are all different religions. A wonderful lady a Chinese American woman who teaches Chinese language, but also is an incredible ballroom dancer. I mean, an incredible, like she could be on Dancing with the Stars. She's that good.
Wow.
And I've got a cattle rancher. I have a wonderful woman who does African dancing, and she tears it up. She's and these people are all in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, even 90s. Who do all these different things. Let me say, so that goes to the diversity of it. But let me say this, that as an older person myself, I'm now 66 years old. I get kind of annoyed when I read about someone 90 years old running a marathon. I'm like, well, good for you.
Whatever. No, I could totally relate to that, because I injured my knee in the 6th grade. First time I injured my knee. Wow. And I've had subsequently more surgeries than I can even name. And as I get older, I realize how much more challenging it is for me to bounce back after knee surgery.
Right.
So yeah, when I see people running, I'm just like, I've never been able to run. Never.
Right.
So yeah,
that's
that
right.
would be annoying.
Yeah,
annoying. I'm just
that's right.
Yeah.
And I'm being a little facetious. Of course, I
Yeah.
admire
Yeah.
someone who does that. But let me
Yeah.
say that I think the news media loves to bring out stories of people who are doing absolutely extraordinary things at old ages, like the former president George H.W. Bush. He did some skydiving when he was like 88 years or whatever it was.
Hmm.
So again, I admire that. I actually admire that. But I didn't want my show to be about that kind of thing, where it's like the woman who is 55 and had her first baby, and I didn't want it to be about that. I wanted it to be
You want it to be
about,
more normal.
yeah, just regular. Now,
Hmm.
by the way, there are some people in my series who are doing extraordinary things for their age, but that is not the focus.
Right.
Like you said, just regular people, because in fact, everyone has a story, and those stories can be incredibly profound and moving.
Yes.
And we have a lot to learn from, like, the person that you see in the supermarket. There's the old lady in the supermarket, pushing a shopping cart. And I guarantee that if you went up and asked her my 27 questions, you would be utterly fascinated.
Exactly. Exactly. You'd be there
Yeah.
for hours.
You'd be exactly right. Yeah.
Because the older you live, the more that history you leave behind, and you've got all of this. To those who can remember, you got all of this information, like,
Exactly.
and you've got decades,
Yes.
and if you've gone from one century to the next, there's a
Exactly.
lot of information and history, and yes, exciting
Exactly.
information.
Exactly. And there's news we can use. In fact, one of my questions is, what's your advice? And they always ask me, well, my advice about what? I'm like, hey, it's up to you.
Right.
And sometimes they give advice to younger people. Sometimes they give advice to people their age. And I have to say, I have not had a boring interview, not once,
I believe that.
always fascinating. And I also think that one thing, there's some things which people often, a lot of people often say things like, for instance, a lot of women say that after they reached a certain age, past menopause, that they felt that they often use the same phrase. They said they became invisible.
Hmm.
And as a man, as a straight guy, I was like, what does that mean? Invisible. And so then they would explain that in their opinion, once they past their childbearing. Now, this is not everyone, and I'm, don't come after
Yeah,
me.
we know it's generalization. Yes,
Yeah,
and
thank
just
you.
a few people.
But I'm struck by how many people have said this, and how many women have said this, that after a certain age, they felt that they were no longer regarded, like looked at. And I don't mean looked at in a romantic or sexual way, literally looked at, noticed.
Right.
By people on the street or in the subway or whatever it was, and how profoundly disturbing that is.
And I would imagine that it might be even more pronounced if you are a Black person, a Latino person, because I found that even when I was younger, there were times where I felt invisible. Someone steps in front of you in the line, or um, goes to get something, just doesn't even acknowledge that you are standing there, or you're moving through this life. It just can totally, like, ignore you getting on the elevator and just not say anything. Just you have that period of feeling invisible as a person of color. And sometimes you just have to think, oh, well, maybe they just didn't see me. But sometimes it's like, I know they saw me standing here. So I would imagine that it's even that much more pronounced
I
when
think that's a really, I'm sorry,
no, just
that's,
saying.
yeah, that's a great point. That's right. I mean, there are issues where race, ethnicity, class, come into this as well. And what you're describing is something you said even before you reached 50, you sometimes felt that you were not regarded, right? Not noticed, not taken into account.
Right.
And I take it that that was not a good feeling, correct?
Nope. So now it's even, okay, now I'm doubly offended that you don't see that I'm a Black woman in America and I'm over 50.
There you go. That's right.
No, but
So,
its series sounds absolutely fascinating. And you said there were no
well,
boring stories. So,
no boring stories in that. There are some tragic stories. I mean, really, truly tragic stories.
mhm,
There are some really funny stories. There's some really great storytellers, right?
mhm,
And I notice that sometimes people will say, as they get to be a certain age, it's liberating because they don't have to worry about what other people think anymore. That's
right.
another thing I've heard a lot. I've heard that a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
So they'll
Yeah, I
say
would imagine.
whatever's on their mind, honey.
Yes. And if they were outspoken when they were younger, they're even more so as they get
Ooh,
older, right?
absolutely. That's exactly right.
I've had some folks like that in my life.
Yep. Just to be
So
deep.
before we let you go, I want to just ask you really quickly about the um, series that you're doing. Well, it's not a series, it's a documentary about the love life of
Ah,
Martin Luther King, you know, and
yes.
Coretta Scott King. Just
Wow.
tell us briefly a little bit about that.
Well, thank you for asking. So this is a fascinating time period that I didn't know about it. And I've lived in the Boston area for many, many, many years. Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King did not meet in Alabama. They did not meet in Atlanta. They met in Boston, of all places. And they met in Boston because they were both students. They were
Mhm.
both graduate students. Coretta Scott, that was her name, Coretta Scott at the time, was a music student at the New England Conservatory of Music. She was a singer. She wanted to be like Marian Anderson, if some of your listeners might know who that is. She was a famous African American singer back in the 30s and 40s.
And
And
if you don't know, you should know.
you
Go look
should
up
know.
Marian
That's,
Anderson. Okay.
that's right.
Daughters of the American Revolution.
Absolutely. That's right. So, and Martin Luther King was studying at the Boston University School of Theology, and he was studying to get his PhD. And he got his PhD there. That's why he's Dr. Martin Luther King. So they were set up on a blind date by a mutual friend.
Oh.
And so this story fascinates me because I bet some of your listeners can identify with going away to college and falling in love for the first time. Now, the fact is that happened to me. I was I happened to be a young college student. I was 17 when I started, but regardless, I met a girl, a young woman, and I thought the world would stop if I couldn't, get next to her. I mean, I was like, we're gonna get married, baby. We're gonna have 6 children, and
Oh my gosh.
I know that's right. And so then, at a certain point, that relationship ended, and I was devastated. I thought,
Mhm.
oh, woe is me. And so there's that issue of the first love, right? Which is a big deal.
Right.
You don't have to be in college to have it. You can be at any place, but often it happens in that time period between, like, let's say 16 and 20, something like that. But so I was fascinated by that. I was also struck by the fact that Boston is a very beautiful city to fall in love in, and it's very romantic. And as I researched this project, I found that they had actually gone on dates in the same places that I had taken my dates, like in some of the same, like the Boston Public Garden, which is a beautiful public botanical garden here
Mhm.
in the city. They'd gone to a certain beach in the Boston area. They'd gone to Symphony Hall. I took a date to Symphony Hall, and all this. So I thought that was great to see them as people, to
Right.
see them as regular people. That was one idea. Another idea was that I found that they were already on the path to greatness. But now, again, they weren't like 17 and 18. They were like, 21, 22, whatever, something like that.
Right. Because this is graduate school.
This is
So
graduate school,
yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
But they were already, their friends knew that something was going to happen with these people. She had been a leader like all through school. He had been a leader all through school. I mean, like, elementary school, middle school, high school, and undergrad. They'd both been very involved in their communities. And when they met, it was like these two titans, coming together. And for that film, I was able to find people still living who had known them and had actually gone to school with them. And let me say to all the budding filmmakers out there, if you have an idea, you should jump on it, right now, because especially if your idea involves historical figures, the sad fact is that older people are, passing away all the time. Right. It's not funny, but they're dying all the time.
But that's the reality, right?
That's right.
Don't wait, because you just don't know what could happen.
So I scoured the country, I scoured the USA for people who had met them in the 50s, and that was hard. And I wound up interviewing, I think, 18 people. Now, not all of them had, so I think a handful of those were people. I found a gentleman who had dated Coretta Scott in college in Boston. And I found a woman who had dated Martin Luther King. And that woman, I found her in Oakland, California. So I flew to Oakland, and I took my little camera, actually my pretty big camera with me, and I arranged it, and I found other people around the country. And what, again, just to emphasize, jumping on these projects, because some of the people were still alive, but they weren't really, in good shape to be interviewed, and you don't want to embarrass anyone, right? So these are just realities of doing historical projects. That project was commissioned by an organization called King Boston, which is building a memorial to Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King on the Boston Common. So the Boston Common is like Central Park in Boston, the big public park. And it's a big, 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 big project. And they thought it might be cool to commission a filmmaker to make a film about whatever aspect of the Kings that he wanted. So this is what I wanted to do. I wanted to see them as regular people, with thoughts and feelings. And as a result of my research, that project took me about 18 months. It's a 30-minute film. I discovered one thing: they were very good looking. Yeah. And I'll tell you, the pictures, we usually think of them as kind of mature people, but I was able to find photographs of them when they were young. And in fact, everyone that I interviewed that spoke of them said they were really
they were nice looking.
They were nice looking, and this is another factor in history that I don't want to go too far with it, but this is a reality, of history, that sometimes people are attracted to each other, not just because they have the same feelings about theology and history, but, because they are people like everybody else, and they're attracted because of, to some degree, because of the way a person looks.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing, and I won't go too much longer, I'll say this. I found out that Coretta Scott had come from a poor family in Alabama, and that she used to pick cotton when she was a little girl to help the family income.
Never knew that.
Neither did I. Isn't that deep? That is deep.
Never knew that.
So
I always had the impression that she came from a family of some degree of wealth. I don't know why. Just always, maybe it was because of the music background, because I didn't know about the music background, but and getting to a certain level education wise, you had to have some level of funds, right, to go to school. So wow.
Well, in the film I deal with how she got the money for school, and she did. Everyone said that she had it could be said, I'm going to use the word noble air about her, that she always had that air of royalty about her. He came from a well-to-do family. And one of the reasons why his family did not want him to marry her was that they wanted him to marry another person from a woman from Atlanta's Black elite.
Yes.
And this woman, from a sharecropping town, Alabama, was not Black elite.
She did not fit that profile.
No,
that's
did
why.
not. Okay. Yeah. So isn't that deep? So again, that film is about their personal lives it's very respectful, but I just kind of want to get into that because these are human beings.
Mm.
And then it goes into how they negotiated from the very beginning. They negotiated how they were going to dedicate their lives to what we now call the civil rights movement, but also have, be married and have a family and raise, And that film has been broadcast a couple of times in Boston on public television, but now it's going national, and so it's going to be distributed nationwide. So I think people will see it all around the country, in Martin Luther or MLK weekend in January 2022, and probably throughout Black History Month.
Black History Month. Well, cannot wait to see it. It sounds absolutely incredible, just from what you've mentioned here. And I have, like I said, seen one of the episodes of Greatest Cemeteries, and so I'm sure that this will also be a masterpiece. So Roberto, thank you again so much for being here on our podcast. And if you would like to let people know how they could get in touch with you or see some of your work, please feel free to let us know.
I will. So robertomighty.com. That's the easiest way. Each show has its own website, but I think that website connects to all the different projects that I'm doing, at any time.
So it's robertomighty.com, yes. And Mighty is MIGHTY, just like it sounds.
Thank you.
And Roberto has agreed to give us a little outro music.
Yes. Let me grab my guitar. I'm going to grab another guitar from another room, okay?
Okay, so we are going to be in for a treat. Roberto is going to play a little something for us, outgoing music. And again, I want to thank all of you for being with us today. You can find me, Angeline, at legacypreservation.life. That's all one word, legacypreservation.life. And we are in for a treat. Roberto is going to play a little something for us.
See if I can get back far enough. Okay, so let me turn this light up a little bit. Get a little brighter in here. Oops, that's too far. So play a little something. A
little flamenco. Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you. Thank you again so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Can't wait to hear it.
Thank you for listening to Heirloom and Legacy. If you want to learn more about the work of Heirloom Estate and Legacy Preservation, you can find us at legacypreservation.life, on Instagram at Legacy Preservation, and on Twitter at Heirloom Legacy. Many thanks to my exceptional executive assistant, Queen Karen Garrison, aka Mommy Activist, and my outstanding engineer, Jonathan Reed. Thank you again for choosing Heirloom and Legacy. Please like, subscribe, and tell your friends about us.